More than 1,000 Americans have been convicted in the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol. About 350 trials are still pending, and the FBI continues its dragnet for suspects. The attack that stopped the count of the presidential vote triggered the largest prosecution in U.S. history. But now, history is being challenged. Former President Donald Trump calls the convicted patriots worthy of pardons. What is the evidence? We begin with the prosecutor in charge. U.S. Attorney Matthew Graves told us what drives the prosecution of January 6th.
The story will continue in a moment.
The crime was severe. It was an attack on our democracy. Once you replace votes and deliberation with violence and intimidation, you've lost the democratic process. You've lost the rule of law. But it's also about the victims, the officer victims who were injured that day, and making sure we hold people accountable for the harm that they inflicted on the 140 officers who reported physical injury.
Matthew Graves has worked in the Bush and Biden Justice Departments. Now, as U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, he's won more than 1,000 January 6 convictions and lost only 2 of the cases at trial.
What is the best evidence that you've had?
The crimes that occurred that day are probably the most recorded crimes in all of our history. You also have the words of the defendants explaining what they were going to do or what they had done.
Took over the Capitol, overran the Capitol. Stop the steal! Stop the steal!
Evidence from the trials show many in the mob were determined to stop the count of the electoral vote that would certify Joe Biden's victory. They were enraged by President Trump's false claims of a stolen election. You must have felt strongly to drive 2,000 miles to Washington.
Yes, sir. I still feel very strongly.
Jared Hughes came from Montana. He's a married 39-year-old construction worker with a daughter and a grievance.
The way this country's headed, my paycheck, my wife's disabled, and it's been hell for us to try to make it with the tens of thousands of dollars of medical bills, and a lot of us see Donald Trump, the outsider, coming in and trying to help us out, trying to help the little guy out against the big government.
That's Jared Hughes at lower right in the khaki cap, among the first inside the Capitol. That's Hughes inside at the door, kicking it out so the mob can rush in.
You guys don't want this! You don't want this! And we are mad! We are mad!
No matter how I look at it, I share some of the responsibility for everything that happened that day, letting people in, being a part of that mob. I didn't personally fight any cops or engage with any officers, but I have a lot of family that are police officers. I have a tremendous amount of respect for police, and I did not like seeing them being assaulted.
We didn't see a lot of respect for police in that video.
Well, no, absolutely. I mean, I'll hold my hand up and say I was wrong. I should not have been screaming at those cops. It's not something I'm proud of.
Others did much worse.
I became trapped. They pinned me against the door frame, and with my arms at my side, I couldn't mount any kind of defense.
Officer Daniel Hodges of D.C.'s Metropolitan Police defended an entrance known as the West Front Tunnel.
Someone was pinning me with a police shield, and another member of the crowd grabbed my gas mask by the filter in front and just started essentially punching me in the face while holding on to it, and then eventually ripped it off my head. And then he stole my riot baton out of my hands and beat me in the head with it.
What were you defending?
Democracy.
Democracy stopped for about 6 hours. The vote was counted at 3:44 a.m. With 2 weeks until Inauguration Day, it was the Trump Justice Department that set the standards for the prosecutions. Decisions were made by career prosecutors who work at justice for years, regardless of who the president might be.
the career prosecutors quickly realized that you needed guidelines in place, determinations about who was going to be charged, who wasn't going to be charged, and what they would be charged with. That process started in January 7th, 2021, during the prior administration. To this day, we continue to use guidelines that the career prosecutors put in place during the prior administration.
And how did they guide you?
What we're generally focusing on of the thousands of people who you could potentially charge that day are people who actually entered into the Capitol, people who engaged in violent or destructive behavior, people who illegally carried firearms or other weapons on Capitol grounds, and people who helped others to get into the Capitol building.
You're not charging everyone who was there that day.
That is correct. We have turned down hundreds of cases where the FBI is saying there is evidence here, it's your determination, prosecutors, whether you think this should be prosecuted.
And why would you turn them down?
Because they don't fit within the guidelines that the career prosecutors have been using, or we don't think that there's sufficient evidence to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt.
U.S. Attorney Matthew Graves told us that January 6th charges range from essentially trespassing to the most serious, seditious conspiracy.
So seditious conspiracy is a Civil War era statute that deals with basically using force against the government to interfere with the operations of the government.
14 have been convicted of seditious conspiracy. One, a militia leader, got 22 years, the longest sentence of all. All of the trials have been in open court in Washington before judges or juries, the defendant's choice. But more than 900, 80%, have pleaded guilty.
And we've seen the defendants in January 6th take full advantage of all the protections afforded under the Constitution. To me, that's the picture of due process.
But due process is not the picture painted at Trump rallies, including this last March.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the horribly and unfairly treated January 6th hostages.
That's a recording of defendants in jail. Mr. Trump has said that he's inclined to pardon many of them.
Well, thank you very much. And you see the spirit from the hostages, and that's what they are, as hostages. They've been treated terribly and very unfairly, and you know that, and everybody knows that. And we're going to be working on that soon as the first day we get into office. We're going to save our country, and we're going to work with the people to treat those unbelievable patriots, and they were unbelievable patriots and are.
The former president has also revised the history of those who died.
That sounds like a gunshot.
One of his supporters was killed by an officer defending the House chamber. 3 other Trump supporters died that day, 1 drug overdose, 2 from cardiovascular disease. And a police officer died of a stroke the next day. In the debate, Mr. Trump acknowledged 1 death, but he said this in August.
When you compare them to other things that took place in this country where a lot of people were killed, nobody was killed on January 6th.
Former President Trump is himself a January 6th defendant in a separate prosecution led by special counsel Jack Smith. Trump was indicted by a grand jury for allegedly conspiring to overturn the election with lies he knew were false. The same myths that stoked rage in Jared Hughes. Where were you getting all this information?
Well, a lot of Fox News, a lot of stuff that I read on the internet. Obviously, Trump himself, saying that the election was stolen.
Fox News paid $787 million to settle a suit that claimed that Fox repeatedly lied about the election and knew it.
Were the January 6 protesters duped?
Yes.
Thomas Griffith is a conservative, retired federal judge who co-authored Lost, Not Stolen, a year-long investigation by conservatives into the 2020 election.
The conclusion of the report was that there's no evidence that fraud changed the outcome of an election in any precinct in the United States of America.
In any precinct?
And all of the evidence, not the speculation, not the conspiracy theories, all the evidence points in one direction, and that is that President Biden won and President Trump lost.
Judge Griffith was appointed by George W. Bush to the Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. He retired in 2020 after working for years with most of the 29 judges who have heard January 6th cases.
None of these judges is politically biased. These defendants had every chance in the world to defend themselves against these charges, and they didn't succeed.
You seem to be saying that justice was done.
Absolutely, justice was done.
Justice for Jared Hughes meant turning himself in and pleading guilty to obstruction of an official proceeding. The Supreme Court struck down that charge in another case, but if Hughes appeals, he'll face other charges that prosecutors dropped. So after 20 months in custody, including prison, he's decided to just wrap up his last days of home detention.
If I come to find out that I was dead wrong on this, that the election was actually legit and Joe Biden got the most votes in presidential history, I would be extremely embarrassed. I would hold my hand up and say I was wrong and I was an idiot. I don't believe that, though. And whether I was right or wrong, I believe what we did was patriotic, because we truly believe that the election was stolen for a number of reasons. We really believe that.
Though the vote count was delayed, the transfer of power was on time, with a new president emerging from that same West Front tunnel defended by Officer Daniel Hodges.
If these defendants are pardoned, then so much of what they believe or believed on that day will be justified in their heads, that if they do it again, that they'll be protected. And it would be just incredibly destructive for the fabric of the country.
Now, the trials themselves will be judged by voters, who will decide whether the defendants were prosecuted as criminals or choir boys.
The allegation is made that the White House is guiding your work.
I've never met President Biden, let alone talked to him, which is normal, I would add, because there are walls, for very good reasons, between the Department of Justice and the White House, so that prosecution can focus on what it should be focused on, whether there are violations of law, and whether those violations of law, consistent with the rules that we follow, should be federally prosecuted.
There are people, maybe millions of people in this country, who are skeptical about what you just said.
No one is being prosecuted for their views. They're being prosecuted for their acts.